Good evening, everyone. I'm Sabiksha Bhatrai. I'm working as a resource coordinator at Social Science Baha, and I would like to welcome you all. I'd like to welcome you all to 113th Social Science Baha lecture series today, and we have a very interesting topic that we are going to discuss and listen to for the next 1.5 hours. So today we have with us Dr. Amina Maharjan, who is going to give a lecture on migration during climate change, broadening the discourse beyond the disaster, displacement and failure to adapt. Dr. Amina Maharjan is a senior livelihood and migration specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, with a PhD in agriculture. She is an interdisciplinary researcher and practitioner specializing in human mobility and migration, sustainable development, and climate adaptation in Hindu Kush Himalaya. Dr. Maharjan's work focuses on the science, policy, and practice interface related to human dimension of environmental change, vulnerability to cryospheric change, air pollution, multi-translocal livelihood resilience, and gender equity and social inclusion. Among her recent publications that she has mostly related to the topic of the lecture today includes Can Labor Migration Help Household Adapt to Climate Change? Evidence from 4 river basins in South Asia, Understanding Rural Outmigration and Agricultural Land Use Change in the Gandaki Basin of Nepal, and Migration and Household Adaptation in Climate Sensitive Hotspot in South Asia. The lecture today will be of around 1.5 hours. The first 40 minutes, Aminaji will give a lecture or share our findings or insights, and then we will have a 30 minutes of question and answers after that. So I would like to open the floor and ask Aminaji to please start.
Thank you, Sadikshaji. Good evening, everyone. As a person who is not really an academic, when Social Science Baha invited me to give a lecture, I thought first and foremost thing was, oh my God, lecture. That's really not my cup of tea. So I know this is a lecture series, and I did agree to this. But what I would be sharing is more, in this climate migration discourse, how things have evolved. And some of these, some of the things that I would be sharing are my own evolving insights and thoughts when we are talking about climate and migration linkages. So please don't consider it as a lecture, because when somebody says it's as a lecture, I feel like it has to be given by a professor, which I'm not. But let me share my thoughts, insights, and experiences in this topic. So, globally, whenever we talk about climate and migration, most of the global narratives, if you look, it focuses on climate migration, climate migrants. So what does a climate migration and what does climate migrant actually mean? And IOM has defined it as movement of a person or group of people. They move predominantly for the reason of climate induced these changes in the environment and livelihoods or economies, and they have to leave their places of origin or habitual places, either temporarily or permanently over short distance within the country or outside international borders. Those mobility is called climate migration. So here the driver should be climate change impacts. That's how this is defined. And if you look, again, that 1.2 billion by 2050, now again, this is a figure that IOM has come up with. It is often used that if the climate change mitigation is not done, if sufficient adaptation is not done, then this huge mass migration or climate displacement that might happen in future. So these are used. The problem with this narrative, and there has been a lot of counter-narrative against this, You know, the problem with this counting is actually it's very, very difficult to count migration, and that to future migration at that scale. Because, you know, it's extremely difficult to actually untangle climate as a major driver. Even now, if you ask most of the people, they would still say, you know, economy, employment as major driver, and climate comes much later. So it's very difficult. And another thing is, most climate migration actually happens internally. So an internal migration is something that's extremely difficult because it's very temporal. People also call it a floating population because it keeps changing. So getting data of internal migration is extremely challenging, and that's why all these figures are problematic. And often, you know, that entire exposed population, if there are climate hotspots, what you would normally do is look into that population living in that hotspots and consider, you know, large part of that population as potential climate migrants, which often doesn't happen. And also, when you're talking about when we speak about climate and migration, most people think about disaster displacements. And displacement itself is very problematic because it's not necessarily permanent. Often flood-related displacements are temporary. So people might be displaced for a certain period of time, and after that they still come back. So when we focus so much on climate migration or climate migrants in this huge number, then you have inherently these problems in counting as well as other problems. For instance, you know, migration really depends on aspiration. Aspiration of the people who are moving, that really matters. And often in these models, these are not considered. Capabilities, because migration is expensive. It might be more expensive for international destination vis-a-vis internal, but the costs are involved. So do people really have that? And also, it might not be necessary for people to move if there is proper in-situ adaptation. So that needs to be considered as well. The ground swell reports have actually done these three different scenarios, worst case scenarios and better scenarios, and they have come up with different numbers. But anyways, these numbers is where a lot of problem actually lies, because when you talk about 1.2 billion, now in the global platform, it is taken as people moving from global south to global north. So that really generates this fear that lots of people will be coming to our countries, you know, would destabilize our systems, and this really starts this fear-mongering. But if you look at evidence so far, you really don't see that massive migration as a result of climate change impact. Now, I'm not saying that this is not happening, but not to the scale that is projected by most modeling results. Now, what the scientific community says, now, even now it is widely used, the Foresight framework. This was developed by in 2011, and it is based on a number of case studies in different locations, including in mountains. So in the edge case region, also these case studies were considered. So, you know, this framework basically says how, you know, migration happens when climate or environmental disturbances, you know, those drivers. So what it says is when environmental, or for that matter, climate change impacts happen, it actually has implications at macro level. So, and all 5 sectors, political, ecological, economical, demographic, you know, social and environment. So at macro level, you see that implications of environmental and climate-related adverse impacts. So based on that macro impact, then households actually take a decision. Do they go or not? Now, even in that decision, it's not only macro. There are meso conditions. For example, does the cultural or social context allow that? Do they have social capital? Do they have economic capital to do it? So a lot of meso factors also matter. Or the political context, does it allow? If getting a passport is extremely difficult, then definitely even if people wanted to move, people will not be able to move. Similarly, household. Are you, you know, gender relations? If you are a woman in the house, do you have that capacity to move? Will the gender roles allow it? Or age, for instance, you know, when you're talking about migration in Nepal, in international it's mostly Gulf countries, Malaysia, and there is an age cap, so to say, because of the kind of work the migrant workers are engaged in. So do you really belong to that age group? If you are 65, probably your chances of migrating is very low. So there are individual household characteristics at macro level. So there is this meso, micro and macro, all three factors that play when people either decide to move or to stay. Now there is another framework, it's called Aspirations and Capabilities Framework, that has also played a very important role on this decision to migrate. So if the environmental or climate change implications makes livelihoods extremely precarious at origin, people might decide to move, but then there needs to be aspiration to go as well as capabilities. But it might also be the other condition is where like people don't have, their livelihoods are precarious, but people actually don't have that capability to move, neither aspiration. So often in Nepal we have this saying, just taking things as it is and not really having that aspirations to grow. So it can fall in different categories, and this is what aspirations capabilities framework say, that a lot of migration depends on these two factors, which are not really considered and extremely difficult to actually include in modeling to come up with those migrant projections. So this is what the scholarship in migration and climate change has come up today. This is a global narrative, and I'm sure it resonates a lot with also the narrative that's going on nationally. But when it comes to Nepal, again, when we are talking about climate change and migration, most people think of disaster displacement, and rightly so, because we are seeing increasing numbers of disasters in this in Nepal, and a lot of that, climate is acting. I wouldn't say climate change is the only factor, because it's obviously not. We had these disasters before as well, but climate change is acting as a threat multiplier. So now we are talking more and more about multi-hazards or cascading and complex hazards and effects. So these are evolved, climate change has a lot of implications on the kind of disasters that we are seeing. For example, Melancholy was unprecedented. A number of triggers actually ended up with that. Very recently in Pakistan, 1/3 of the country underwater, and those are massive disasters, and climate change has played a significant role in the intensity of those hazards. So whenever we talk about climate and migration, that's why at the forefront people think of disaster displacement. And in case of Nepal, climate induced, it's mostly floods and landslides, but non-climate, because it doesn't have a link, earthquake is a major trigger for displacements to happen. And it's projected that by 2050, the losses from disaster will increase to almost 2.2% of, equivalent to 2.2% of GDP. So definitely it's a huge concern, and it's not a surprise that when we're talking about climate change, people think of disaster displacement. And it's very interesting, the stakeholders who work on climate change and stakeholders who work on migration are very different. It's only now that we are beginning to see that, people being interested in both. Because I actually spent quite some time on labor migration. Because in Nepal, if you talk about migration, people think of labor migration to Gulf countries and Malaysia. And again, not surprising, considering the kind of importance that it has at national economy, forget about household economy. So so that's why when you talk about migration, and I think my colleagues who have worked on migration would agree with me, we think of labor migration, particularly to Gulf countries and Malaysia. So what does labor migration mean? So labor migration is basically people moving for work purposes. This is again, I borrowed the definition from IOM, from one state to another. So if the international boundaries are crossed, then it becomes international labor migration, but it can also be internal labor migration. But we do not speak so much of internal migration in Nepal. We really focus on international labor migration. Now, census has come up with these findings. Apparently, almost 7.5% of total population was reported as living outside the country in 2021 census. Now, we have to remember that migrants belong to specific age group. So it's mostly between 18, 19 to 45. So if you're talking about the young youth, then this percentage really increases. So that's why we are so interested in this labor migration. And also in terms of GDP, in 2021, again, 8.2 billion US dollars, and that's, so the critical role that remittances play at the national economy, at household economy, and that's why labor migration becomes so important. But it's, again, some other facts to remember. Labor migration, it's mostly men, young men, women less than 10%, and this figure has remained consistent over a period of time now. And what has changed recently is the diversity in destination. Earlier we were talking about Gulf countries and Malaysia, but now that diversity has really, destination diversity has really changed. The latest report said 150 countries, and with Europe, new destinations in Europe opening up, including, I think, the process, it's still under process with UK and Germany having that bilateral labor migration agreements. We also speak about migration and development, or migration and non-development, because this is something, if you look at this narrative, then it's very conflicting. If you speak with people who are working on migration, we tend to speak migration in a more positive aspect, whereas, as Sadiksha ji mentioned, by training I'm an agriculturist. So if I speak with my colleagues, with my alumni from agriculture, most of us tend to think migration in a negative light. We feel that because of migration, it is hampering agricultural development and development of the country overall. So, if you look into this, the narrative is very complex, conflicting, and that's because the reality is very, very muddy. So it really depends on how which lanes you are bringing. And often these narratives are driven by your disciplines or your views on overall migration. And this is why we don't have a very linear narrative. And this is not only in Nepal, this is globally. Often people talk about the social cost of migration, particularly the institution of marriage. You will hear this across these migration debates, how because of migration, more divorces are happening and so on. There is a level of truth, but that's not absolute truth either. So I used to, for instance, there was a case study somebody had presented, how the husband was going for migration after 2 cycles of 3 years. He wanted to go for the 3rd cycle. The wife was saying that, no, let's not do it. Whatever we have earned, whatever savings we have made, now let's start, our life here. Don't go. But somehow husband thought, no, he needs to go for 1 or 2 more cycles, decided to go. And the wife decided to, also made a decision that, she felt that she would have a better life with a husband who is present than a husband who is absent. So decided to divorce him and move ahead with her life. And that was projected as social cost of migration. Now again, it's up to your lens. I would say it's also probably that gender and empowerment, because it's also whose decision, right? So a lot of these narratives, conflicting narratives, is also as a result of, as I said, from what thought process we are getting into that discussion. But what we have clearly evidence is the impact of remittances and migration on poverty. At national level, I think it is attributed to around 7 or 8% of poverty reduction in Nepal at national level is attributed to migration and remittances. So it is, again, established that the remittances has been much more effective in reducing poverty, food insecurity, as compared to development aid or other work. So that's where, you know, that positive contribution. Again, migration and remittances has been attributed for better access to health. So people who receive remittances are much more likely to access health services vis-a-vis non-migrants. Similarly, it has shown positive implications on school enrollment and also on assets and infrastructure. I think this is very common that all of us have these aspirations to have at least a house. That might be a small or a big bungalow, depending on your capabilities. But everybody has that aspiration, and often migration is used to make, you know, that wealth, that asset creation in terms of either a small house or a small, you know, land holding, khaderi, in order to construct a house. So, you know, these are the positive contributions from migration and remittances that has been established through large-scale studies. When it comes to policy narrative, and this is where it gets very, very interesting, there is clear dichotomy on policy narrative. So you have migration policy, and if you look into migration policy, it's very clear. They would like, it doesn't say promotion. I think that's why Foreign Employment Promotion Board's name has been changed, because they don't want to use the word promotion, but it is there. The major mandate is management, but, you know, looking at these destinations, the increase and all, that management promotion angle is there. It is also mentioned in periodic plans. I think since 10th 5-year periodic plans, this has been mentioned. But if you look into other policies and plans, migration becomes absolutely invisible. Most of the time it remains in the background that this is happening, but when it comes to policies, what needs to be done, to strategic objectives, then it's completely lost. So, and again, even among the policymakers who are mandated to implement migration policy and so on, there is this dichotomy. So it looks like most of us want remittances, but we don't want migration. And this is where I think that struggle, that dichotomy actually persists, or not only in policies and plans, but also in our own mindsets. Now, these are the things that's actually discussed. So in Nepal, displacement is discussed, on the climate change context. Labor migration is discussed under migration context, not under climate change context. We don't bring these two together. And migration and development in general is discussed. But what we have not discussed, and what you will see these missing aspects are these linkages between climate change, migration, and agriculture. So often you will see debates, as I said, agriculture is by training. We are very good in blaming migrants and migration for the this very dismal performance in agriculture sector, but we have really not understood that granularity in this linkages, how this nexus actually works. The climate links in the whole labor migration, because climate has very important implications on not only internal but also international labor migration, and that we have really not discussed. Internal migration and rural-urban, this continuum. We still think of rural and urban areas as separate entities, whereas in reality there is so much of connection between rural and urban areas, and that's because of the migrants. And just today I was reading a short summary from a colleague. I think they have launched this climate change survey report, and it was conducted. It was a large-scale survey with I think 6,000 plus participants, and I was just looking at how people are adapting to climate change, adverse impacts of climate change, and of course there were some adaptation happening in farm sector. In non-farm sector, around 28% people say that they engage in temporary internal migration. So I think this is the first time that a survey has come up with a figure on internal migration as an adaptation, because this is often not discussed. Similarly, migration and changing socioeconomic situation. Again, this is something we don't discuss because migration also has implications not only socio-economic, but actually I should have said socio-ecological systems. Those changes are happening that we are not discussing. Migration as adaptation, because again there is this disconnect between what policymakers and academia and others are talking about adaptation and what households are actually strategizing in order to adapt to the adverse impact of climate change. And this is actually not discussed. Lastly, when we talk about migration, we completely forget about immobility. It's not like everybody can move. And not being able to move is actually a huge concern. And this is something we don't know. Probably by not being able to move, people are living in a very high risk and precarious situations. And this is again not discussed when we are talking about climate and migration. Now let me briefly touch upon all these not discussed aspects and why it is important that we broaden this discourse and start to look into these aspects as well. Now migration and agriculture, if you look, these are the two major sectors of economy. So together it contributes to almost around 30% of the country's GDP. So remittance, of course, not part of GDP, almost equivalent, so around 30% equivalent comes from remittances, and agriculture sector again is about 30%. So together more than 50, but roughly around 60% of GDP. So these are two major economic sectors in Nepal. And the census has again come up this figure that more than 60% of labor force is actually engaged in agriculture sector. As I said, 7.5% of total population living outside, so migration. And it also says that remittance receiving households, it's more than 60%. And therein lies this linkage between migration and agriculture. So it's mostly, we are talking about India, Gulf countries and Malaysia, it's mostly farm families, the members from farming households that are migrating. And this is where that linkage happens, how migration and agriculture is linked. Another important thing, why that happens, and this is where I think it's important to also understand how climate change and agriculture is linked. Now, Nepal is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. It ranks 139, so 82nd is the most vulnerable, and 139 is not that far away from 182, right? So it's really, when it comes to the ranking, Nepal is very, very vulnerable to climate change. And why this is happening, it's not like climate change impacts are happening only in Nepal and it's not happening in more developed country context. It is happening. But we have this pre-existing vulnerability, poverty, food insecurity, discriminations, access to services like health, sanitation and others. And this is what makes populations highly susceptible to even smaller changes happening in the climatic conditions. In terms of very tangible, tangible impacts that you will see in climate change is in terms of winter rains. This is something you will hear consistently and from east to west, that the winter rains are going. The winters are getting more and more drier. And this has a huge implication on the production of wheat and other crops. And monsoons are getting better. And the extreme events, extreme rainfalls, these are increasing. And also these floods, landslides. Sindhupalchok is a very typical example of this high vulnerability. 2015 earthquake. Now this is where that complex disasters matter, because 2015 earthquake, when it happened, it really made a lot of, what is the term? Geomorphological damages in these hillsides. And since then, all these heavy rainfalls is leading to higher landslides, right? So this is how climate change actually becomes a threat multiplier in case of Nepal. Now, globally, it says that, so this was a study done by FAO, I believe, and they found that, from post-disaster need assessment, from the disasters, around 23% of loss and damage actually happens in agriculture sector. And when you consider drought, 80% of the loss and damage due to drought happens again in agriculture sector. So smallholder farming is one of the most vulnerable sectors when you are talking about disasters and climate change impacts, because this is, very much climate dependent, natural resource dependent sectors. But if you look into adaptation, very little, and most of them is happening autonomously. Autonomously means like people, the farm families, communities doing things on their own without any state or non-state support. So it's not planned. For instance, people trying to change their sowing seasons with the changing climate. We were just back from Sintapalchuk, and when we are talking about climate change, people just say that we don't know the seasons anymore. We don't understand the seasons anymore. So we don't know what seasonal calendar to, because we are talking about seasonal calendar, and they say there is no seasonal calendar anymore because things have shifted to such an extent that you can't plan as you used to do before. We still have this Asar Pandra Daichura, because that's when you start to plant rice. But then now, you never know if you'll be able to plan that or not, because monsoons are become so difficult to predict. So under all these conditions, when there is no adaptation measure, there is very little support to adapt to these changes, to spread the risk, reduce the risk. And this is where many of these farm households are using migration as a strategy, because this helps them to diversify their incomes. Now, the picture here is a bit blurry, but doesn't matter. This is satellite image from Baki. So the green one is the year when the monsoons came timely, so people could actually plant rice. And the figure down is when the monsoons were not timely. Now, just scale the large scale, that large area that was not planted because of lack of rains. And for farmers who are dependent on rice as a primary crop, this means a huge precarity to their livelihoods. And this is where the decision to migrate actually comes. And this is how migration, climate change, and agriculture or farming actually gets integrated. Maybe just another example from Langtang. I know a lot of people have, and I see Austin there, who have studied Langtang. So, when 2015 earthquake happened, the earthquake per se actually did not destroy Langtang villages. It was the avalanche that was triggered by earthquake. Now that avalanche happened because the snowfall on that year happened much later. It was sometime in March. So it did not stick and it came down, and that's what destroyed. Almost 25% of the population of Langtang got killed, and the entire village was buried. So the village had to relocate to areas which used to be their farm. So the farmland was used. Yaks, a lot of yaks were killed. Not only yaks, yak herders were killed, and this was something very unique that I learned. So the people were saying there were so many stray yaks, and I didn't understand. Yaks is so valuable, right? So how can you live? Then they were saying that actually yaks know only specific family members, the herders. They don't know others, right? So people didn't know their yaks anymore. The yaks also didn't know their herders anymore because the herders got killed. And that kind of, this has such a huge implication in their whole yak herding practice. And that has gone significantly down after that earthquake, because they have lost human resources that's required. They have lost so much of financial resources as a result that they've been not able to get back to that yak herding practices as before. So this is how, I'm just giving two examples of how climate change, migration, and agriculture, because a lot of people in Langtang now aspire to migrate. It was very surprising. I was talking to a person there, and his aspiration was that his daughter should marry somebody from outside. Then you have this expanded social network, and they believe that that is the way to build their resilience. Now, I mentioned, like, if we are talking to the stakeholders who work on labor migration, we don't see climate. And honestly, when I say we, it's been only 10 years now that I have been trying to look into this interlinkages. Before that, I also didn't understand. I would have said labor migration and climate, what are you talking about? But there is this link, and in migration we call cycle, migration cycle. There are different phases. For simplicity, I have just put 3 phases. Decision, that is an origin, wherever people come from, destination and return. this is as I mentioned, most people come from farm families because most migrants are also coming from rural areas. So farm-based livelihood precarity as a result of adverse impact of climate change, very clear. If not the predominant factor, then one of the threat multipliers. Climate change is definitely there. What is often not discussed is the climate change impact at destination for the life, health of the migrant workers. Now we often talk about migrant death in Gulf countries and Malaysia. And if you look into that database, there are some which is work-related accidents, understandable, road accidents, but majority, a huge chunk is what you call people just died, natural causes, and sometimes they say either sudden death, natural causes, or heart attack is given as a reason. But I think we have not really understood, because in Gulf countries we are talking about people working in extreme heat and outside. So climate change is also impacting Gulf countries. If we are talking about deserts, Gulf countries, which normally is very high temperature they have. So even like 2 degrees increase can be fatal. And this is something that we have really not talked about, that we have not really understood, and that needs to be understood. Because how migration helps development or adaptation depends on the resilience of migrants themselves. And it's not only in international, even in internal migration. When you're talking about floods or vector and waterborne diseases, Kathmandu has seen this epidemic of dengue, and how are these impacting migrant workers? One of my studies in Kathmandu Valley, where we did this, we were doing, trying to understand air pollution. This is a huge problem in Kathmandu. How air pollution impacts this vulnerable occupational group. We realized that more than 50% are internal migrants. And this occupation group that we had selected were taxi drivers, Sadiq Shetty is there, we were together in that study. Taxi drivers, street vendors, construction workers, and I forgot the 4th category. Yeah, and construction. And we realized that, air pollution, so, as such they are working as daily wage workers with no safety nets whatsoever. If you fall ill, and you can't go to work, you lose that day's wages. And if you really have a problem, you also have to bear the cost of healthcare, right? So it erodes their savings so quickly, and air pollution and its impact is driving people to perpetually remain in that vicious cycle of vulnerability. So in one case study, we found that 2-3 years of saving was wiped out when this person fell ill. And how it happened was, till that symptoms were not so serious, people keep saying that okay, we will do it later because your whole sole priority is to work, to earn. And people were saying that, the workers were saying that if we are delayed in work by 2 hours, the wages are cut for 2 hours. And that's why they don't want to reduce their working hours. And that has, that health symptoms get accumulated, it gets more serious. And after some time, then they have forced to take longer, breaks, and all that health-related cost, and that has really impacted their savings. They are now again back into debt, and now since you have no debt to pay, so you again have to force yourself to work more. That vicious cycle continues, and this is something we have not really looked into. And of course, air pollution and climate change has linked, which I'm not going to talk about now. Also return, because when we are talking about labor migration, particularly to Gulf countries and Malaysia, I don't know about the newer destination, what that would look like in future. But these are all cyclical, because these are all contractual migration that happen for 2-3 years, and then they come back, they go again. So everybody's coming back, that's given. When the migration cycle completes, maybe in 4 years for some, 12 years for others, they would come back. But when they come back, what are the sectors that's actually available for them to invest those remittances so that they can make a living here? Because when they come back, they are in productive, economically very productive age, 40, 45, right? And this is where, again, climate change can have a huge implication. So if people have, here I have put example from Melamji, not this resort, but there was actually a case of another in Helambu, where two brothers, they had invested so much of money, and this I borrowed from one article in Down to Earth, and I met with the journalist, and we were talking. They invested in running, in having that infrastructure to run a homestay resort kind of thing. When Melamji happened, everything got destroyed. Now they are left with huge debt. So what do you do? 50, 60 lakhs. How do you pay that debt from working in farms, or for that matter, even in Kathmandu in smaller jobs? So both the brothers were forced to migrate again, whereas they had thought that, okay, we are done with this migration cycle, now we want to settle back, invest. See, reintegration, return can also be impacted. And this is where I think that climate, again, has a link in this labor migration cycle. So I'm putting it very briefly here because there is not so much of evidence still, but we have seen anecdotal evidences, and that prompts that we need to understand this better. Internal migration, as I was saying that, I was so happy to look at that report. 28% people said that, you know, internal migration as an adaptation strategy, but we have not really talked about it. Because globally, it's all international. Globally also, it is actually internal migration. The evidence show that climate-related migration is actually internal globally, but then narrative is all about international, right? What we are also seeing now is what I call creeping disasters, so that very prolonged drought or prolonged or frequent, let's say, very frequent flooding. These also makes places inhabitable, and people are moving out, and that gradual retreat from their original areas, this is also happening. Now again, anecdotal evidences. Two of my students have actually studied it, but what we believe is this might actually be going on at large scale, and we don't understand this, and it's extremely important to understand that dimension. Again, as I said, rural and urban, we think it as two distinctly different landscapes, but in reality there is so much of connections, and we have not understand that either. And of course there is no policy. When it comes to internal migration, absolutely nothing. And it's not only in Nepal, in most South Asian countries we have no internal migration policies. And that's a huge gap in policy landscape that needs to be filled. Now, as I mentioned, one of my students did this study in Ramechhap, where it is a rain shadow area, so normally it receives lower rainfalls, but now over a period of, what people said was like over a period of 60, 70 years, the rains have gone down to such an extent that one women family members during dry season would be required 8 to 10 hours of one women family only to get water for drinking and for livestock and others. So it becomes practically impossible to continue to live there. And what you call, I think this is something very common we hear about, from hilltop to basin. People moving to more river basins here because their water is available. And this is something, again, we don't understand so much. Migration itself is bringing a lot of socioeconomic changes. Again, that's something we don't understand. We keep talking about, it's not like we don't acknowledge, we keep talking about feminization of agriculture sector. We keep talking about, the villages not having youth anymore. What does it mean? That's something we have not internalized when it comes to implementing programs or plans and so on. Just the other day, Dr. Anil Pokhrel from NDRMA, who was saying that yes, when we are doing this disaster preparedness, we realize that it's actually women, children, people with disability, and older people who are in the village, and we have to train them. So do we really have, what kind of training do we give them? Do we really have equipments that would help them for rescue, for instance, right after disaster? So these are the things that you need to really internalize and make it, but that's really not happening. Depopulation now, after the 2021 census came out, like 32 districts have actually reported negative growth rates. So they are losing population. This is again, that makes those who are remaining extremely vulnerable, and this is something again we don't understand. And changing narratives. Now, this is a picture that I took, I think, in Darelbura, and women were climbing. That when I saw that, I was so scared. On top of that tree to get that to get the fodder for their livestock. So literally, women are doing everything else, but are we really internalizing it and reflecting it in our programs? Because that is where I think it's not happening so much. The other thing that is not really discussed, migration as an adaptation. Now there is a lot of debate is migration and adaptation, because mostly people understand it as failure to adapt. So migration as maladaptation, failure to adapt. But there is increasing evidence that migration can also be an adaptation. So what happens is, I think this part I have explained. You have your, present socio-political systems, the institutional governance mechanism under which this migration happens. And all these interventions are policies, plans, projects, These all have an implication in terms of what kind of outcome migration has. Because if the outcome is positive, then migration becomes an adaptation strategy. But if the outcome is negative, then it becomes a maladaptive strategy. But if you look at intervention, this is where that not integrating migration in policies, projects, plans becomes a problem. Because when this is all blind, the likelihood of migration outcome getting into this negative zone becomes higher, right? For instance, so much of labor migration happening. If there was no management, if there was no institutional and policy mechanism in place, the likelihood of not really labor migration, but actually getting into the trafficking would be higher, right? So if you look at internal migration, that migration policy gap, this makes that outcome being more negative higher. So this is something we need to understand. So what does it mean when you're talking about migration as adaptation? So to be an effective and successful adaptation, what needs, very basic is it has to reduce the precarity of livelihoods and life. It has to increase the adaptive capacity, so that overall the net result is well-being is improved, right? And these three concepts have a lot of overlaps, and that's why we put it. And when you're talking about this improved well-being, reduced precarity, increased adaptive capacity, we are not only talking about migrant households, because often if you look at studies, including the study that I was part of, we look at origin. So what happens is, at origin, the migrant households' adaptive capacity, well-being is being improved at the cost of migrants. So migrants' well-being is being declined. So it's important that we consider these implications in all, not only in migrants and migrant households, but also in immobile population, people who have not moved, who are still at home, or remaining population, and also relocated and retreated population, how that impact is having there. So for that, it is essential that we work not only in one origin, but also look into destination and look into this urban, in internal migration, that would be rural-urban continuum. So look at connections, because that's going to be critically important. If migration can lead to better well-being for all these stakeholders, that's when it becomes a very successful and effective adaptive strategy. Again, as I said, one thing that we forget when we are talking about migration is immobility. Earlier, in 2011, when first that framework came, there was more talk about trapped population. So people who are highly vulnerable, living in risky areas, but unable to move, so they were trapped. But the scholarship has actually advanced, and now there is an understanding that it's not only trapped, there could be also voluntary immobility. People don't either want to move or need to move. So, but this immobility in a mountain context in Nepal we have very little understanding. We don't understand those factors. A lot of study has been done in Bangladesh and in coastal areas, but in mountain context now just 1 or 2 studies have started, but it's largely we don't know. And it is important to understand this dimension. So, looking into all these aspects, why it is important to think beyond displacement, beyond climate migration is, if we understand this broader narrative of migration, if we broaden this narrative, then we would also understand the implication it has, the migration has in its socio-ecological system, so that what does it mean is we actually understand adaptation needs in more granularity. So what are really the adaptation needs of the people? Is it really that 100 rupees seed packets, or is it something else? Because then we can actually, because resources are limited, and this would really help in effective use of those resources. And it is high time that we start to integrate migration, both internal and international, and adaptation plans. So when we talk about adaptation, we are always thinking our default setup is in situ adaptation. But now we need to start to look into mobile people, translocal people, and start integrating this in adaptation plans, or for that matter, development plans. Because if we do that, what will happen is it will be easier to reduce displacement. Because if there are very high risk areas, we already know that people need to move. This would help reduce displacement. Also, right now nobody's talking about migration as adaptation, but if this is a strategy that is overwhelmingly used by households, and right now the whole burden of adaptation is on households, then maybe it's time to really facilitate this process, to share that burden. So start to think of a legal framework where we can actually support people for safer migration, facilitated migration, so that if they can have that positive implication on adaptive capacities as well. That it actually helps people to people's in situ adaptive capacities. And if we broaden this discourse, that's when we also start to understand this climate-related immobility and the consequences of that. And overall, all of our aspirations is sustainable development. This would also be helped. So if you look into the foresight framework, which I had presented, how people decide to migrate. So I think one reverse loop would be migration when it happens in significant number. This is going to have also implication in all these aspects at macro level, and this is what we are seeing in Nepal now. But since we have not systematically looked into it, we have not understood it in detail, and it's very high time that we start to look into it. Thank you so much. I know I've taken a lot more time.
We will get to the question. Thank you so much, Amina ji, for such a insightful lecture today. And you brought a lot of topics that we also discussed a few weeks back, like immobility and climate change. How do we link labor migration and climate change in the context of Nepal, when most of the discourse is on disaster displacement? Thank you once again. Now I'd like to open the floor for questions. We'll take few questions, 2-3 questions once, and then we will have Amina ji address that, and then we'll get back to next set of questions. We have one question from the front.
Do we have a mic?
Yeah, we have.
Hello ma'am, good evening. First of all, many thanks for the talk. I'm Abhay Vising and I'm from India, and I'm also trying to work on implications of climate change on public health, and my fieldwork is in Uttarakhand. So since you've talked about climate change and migration in detail, and I am also trying to invoke Amartya Sen's capability approach. In the talk, somewhere down the line you mentioned that there's not willingness, people are not willing to, in some cases, people are not willing to, migrate. So, and in some cases, people are, become helpless and they, migrate, but they don't have resources. So, would you like to explain it with respect to Amartya Sen's, he brings in the idea of agency, and, he also brings the idea of beings and doings. So, I mean, that would further help in clarifying the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina. An excellent talk and a real sweep through changes in the contemporary discourse. And I love the concept of migration as adaptation and the prompt to think about it more. I just wanted to throw on top of that also the concept of managed retreat, which is something that's gaining a lot more currency. something maybe of interest in this community as well. And the idea, in particular, I'm thinking of a professor at the University of Delaware named A.R. Siders, who's published a couple of things on transformative managed retreat. So the concept of, when we talk about managed retreat, as you also pointed out, it depends on the capabilities and the terms and the political rights situation. So trying to configure that there is a need for retreat in anticipation to reduce displacement, ensuring that the actual system of negotiation process of retreat is transformative and potentially empowering and helping, again, navigate the power dynamics within the community and perhaps at broader scales as well. So I love the entire talk, and I'm right there with you at the end. This type of discourse, which I'd love to see more of in Nepal. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amina ji. Actually, my question is different. Why not people migrate from somewhere? Like, for example, like Thar people in Nepal. Now, in the past, the survival strategy when they were not migrated from malaria. Even in the 100 years ago, in Kathmandu, there was a disaster earthquake, and Kathmandu peoples, I think, not significantly migrated from here. Likewise, in Lantang, you already told that some people, most of people were temporarily migrated by force also, by government also, but now they return back to in their trick zone. Like others, like Manangi people, in 1970s, they temporarily migrated for their business, and now they backed and revived the Manang. These are some examples. For example, in the Africa, it was the area there is a paper on wildlife. The people think that there were two groups of some Samuha group, wildlife Samuha group. One is migrated, one is not migrated. But thought that there were same species. But when it was checked, it was examined, the species were different. Those non-migrated and migrated. So I want to ask, why some peoples, for example, in the Himalayas and in the Thrais, why they are not migrated? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's interesting. Most of the question is related to immobility. So I'm glad, because I think this is where that discourse needs to happen as well. So Abhijji, happy that you're working in Uttarakhand. So one of the studies that I had, at least a clipping that I had put here, also happened in Uttarakhand. So I think this is a study that you definitely should be reading from Himani and others. It says, we are still here, climate change, gender and immobility. And this is in Uttarakhand. So, it really, so immobility is an area that we don't really understand so much. But what Himani's study says is it's because of place attachment. People are very attached to that place. It's also because of, they feel that, they are better off, given the resources that they have at origin and in destination if they move. They thought that they have better access to resources in their origin. There is also social context. So in Uttarakhand, if you look, I think 400 plus villages with less than 10 people. And among them, I did do a study there. Most of them were either single women, separated women, and older people. So for single separated women, they thought that they are better off because they don't have that social network. Because in migration, social network plays a very, very critical role. Without that, it's very difficult to migrate. and they thought that they don't have that. Older people, because of this attachment, they were like, we were born here, we are going to die here. We are not going to move. So there are so many other factors as well, and it's difficult. So in Mustang, Mustang we were last time. So when we asked, because most Mustangs actually migrate internationally, and that cost massively, $50,000, $60,000. But then it was interesting when we said that are there people who can't move because they can't afford, and they said no. If somebody is interested, they will find one or the other person who will, pay that cost and help them, get that job so that they can return. And the only people who were not able to move were people with disabilities or families with that, and that was their limitation. So there are various these factors, and we don't understand. In Sindhu culture, we were just talking, somebody had come back. Actually, they came to Kathmandu and went back, and they said, "Why did you come back?" They said that we were there, and people started to say that you look like Dalit, and I don't want you working in my kitchen. So that then drove. So there was this social dimension again. So it's very difficult. So it's, agency is one, but in migration, the critically important is that relation, social network, and that plays even more important role than individual agency per se. And I think this is something you will need to consider. Managed retreat, and I'm a big fan of that, because I don't think that planned relocation, that's considered at the moment as the only way forward, after displacement and planned relocation. But I seriously believe that managed retreat is the way forward, and that can be transformative. And there are examples, I think, around, and this is again something we need to understand better. So how that managed retreat actually take place, what are the ways that the government and others can, non-government sector can support, so that, the risk of displacement is reduced, but not planned relocation that ends up with so much of failure. So I think this is an area that really needs better understanding, and I hope that this is an area that I'm keenly interested in, and I would be working as well, so very much so. Not only managed retreat, there is also something called generational retreat that happens in coastal areas, how slowly in over generation people actually start retreating. In the case of Ramechhap, there were 3 villages we studied, and it was fascinating because one was mixed village with Brahmin, Kshatris and Dalits. There it was individual decision. So it was the most well-to-do people who left, and they actually sold their land in their village and moved downstream. So they actually gained from that mobility. But those who came later, they were like economically they were lower. They didn't have land in downstream, they didn't have those social networks. So when they moved, they couldn't sell their land. And those who have actually purchased land from, socioeconomically better off houses, they actually had double loss. Whereas there was another community, completely Dalits, and they took a collective strategy because they realized they don't have land. We are not going to be able to, rent and stay. So, as a village, they actually sat together. It's saying that, okay, now this is not livable. We can't continue to live in this village as it is. This water is simply not sufficient. So as a village, they collectively decided that it's time to shift, and they shifted as a whole. So different approaches being taken, and this is where I think a lot of understanding needs to happen. And again, this is something I keep saying that not only in Nepal, but in most mountain contexts, we are still an informal society, and a lot of things happens informally. But then, like when you are having those projects, plans, everything is very formal. That space for informal, informal settings, networks, similarly the local knowledge systems, that space is really not given, and that needs to be given. And this is what I believe here, this, for a transformative change, this managed retreat would need to consider. So completely agree with it. Regarding your question about why certain people don't, again, as I said, this is an area where we know the list, why people don't move. In case of Langtang, because that's an area that I have actually spent quite some time, what people told us were like the places that they were given as to shift, to relocate, were in Tarai. They said that we are mountain people. What do we know about Tarai and the life there? So they just couldn't. They thought it's no point because we are used to the cold weather. We are used to yaks. Now Tarai has no chance of yachts, and we have no idea about cows. So they thought that the skills required, this is a kind of chains for whom they were really not equipped. And that's why, as a community, they decided that no, we go back to Langtang, right? So really, what are the options? And that place attachment, probably if they were given another option where they had similar kind of environment, landscape, probably they would have taken that option. So many factors, matter because their sense of identity, that place attachment. So these are the things that we really need to understand, that why some people move and why others don't. Now you mentioned about Tharos not moving. Probably, in Tarai, it still is better vis-a-vis others. But now Uttarakhand, Abeji, where you have come, they're like the indigenous people, Johars, I forgot names. They have actually moved, and they have used that mountain identity. They have actually cast in on that identity to have a very managed, when I say managed, not government managed, the community managed retreat to downstreams, and they have done that excellently. So I think these are the things that we really need to understand. And I remember this discussion with in Mustan. They said that our culture is, migration is in our culture. Migration and flexibility. Without these two, we can't survive as a community. And I was speaking to a Thakali person there, local leader, and said that this is very much given. We have always done that. So in some, that this culture is there, and they kept saying that when the opportunities are somewhere else, we will go. When the opportunities we see back home, we will come back. But that mobility, that flexibility it's given. That's how we have improved our livelihoods and lifestyle. And I think it also depends on the culture of mobility and sedentary. Because mostly in plain areas, people have, the culturally over a period of decades or centuries, sedentary culture has evolved. Whereas in mountains, because of the topography, that mobility has always been part of it. So I think a lot of that cultural connotations and all that we have not understood, and we need to understand.
Thank you, Amina. We'll take next set of questions. We have one hand raised here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Amina. Thank you so much. Oh yeah, thank you so much. I am Tehzeeb and I'm from Pakistan. Basically, I'm doing my PhD in Canada. I live in the Himalayan ranges in Pakistan. That's the Gilgit-Baltistan province. And I see a lot of migration. But then there's actually no solution for that. For example, there are kind of multiple risks there and hazards there, and people are kind of having different kind of vulnerabilities. For example, a community has moved because there was a flash flood, and they moved to a safer area, and then there was another kind of risk they faced, that there was the water scarcity in that region, and they moved to the other place, and that was kind of another thing they came up. So I need to say that this mobility will not end. So they're kind of like no solution for it means like, what about the kids? Do they have any future or not if they're still moving from one place to another and they don't have a safe future kind of thing?
We have one.
Thank you, ma'am. It was very comprehensive and informative presentation. You have one of the suggestions, you have mentioned that some legal pathways are necessary to facilitate and leverage migration as adaptation. And also you have also talked about the need to understand adaptation needs in granular. Where do you see the gaps in laws? Can you be a little bit specific, just to understand what we need?
Questions? While we wait for some questions from the floor, I have this something that we also discussed, and I also wanted to like have a discussion here with others as well. Like you mentioned this in the beginning, it's really difficult to link migration to migration as an impact or adaptation to climate change, because most of when we ask someone why they are migrating, they will say it's for economic reason or maybe some social reason, but climate change really comes up as a driver of migration, and this has also been the case in countries like Bangladesh as well, because I see that in one recent study, only 7% of these surveyed said that climate they migrated because of the coastal floods or something like that. So I just wanted to ask, how do you know how can we make this link, methodologically, for new researchers as well who are interested in climate, in doing this research on climate and migration. From your experience, do we use a qualitative method? Do we have quantitative method? Do we have mixed method? How can we create this linkage? And I'm also interested in this study that you have done in, I think it's in South Asia, Four River Basin in South Asia. So can you tell us what you found in terms of how you linked climate and migration in that study, and some of the findings in regards to adaptation, and if there was any differences between the three different, because I think it was across India and Nepal for different
India,
reasons.
Nepal, Bangladesh and Pakistan.
Yeah, so.
Thank you for the questions. I think the colleague from GB, that's a very valid question that you ask. Often people are basically choosing from one risk to another, and this is where, again, something that the entire South Asian region does not do is looking into the future, that anticipatory actions. Because that becomes critically important, not only now, you might feel that, okay, here, drought risk, let's move to downstream, then there is flood risk. What about, okay, you might consider that now it is a safe place, you go, invest, build, and then 5 years down the line, that place also becomes risky. So that anticipatory, action is something that we are missing. Planning by default is for future, but when we are doing planning, we are forever looking back or present. And looking at present and past, we are actually planning for future. And this is where inherently we have an issue. Because if you look at climate science has very clear indications, in terms of what is likely to happen in future. So why don't we build on that? And you would be fascinated, because that's something this is now again increasing, I believe, in local knowledge system that we have undermined to such an extent that people themselves don't believe in their knowledge system anymore, which is very sad. But people understand that changes. It's fascinating. This was in India, Ladakh. People were absolutely clear. They said that 20 to 30 years, our glaciers are gone. We are going to run out of water. And they are already thinking now, in 30 years' time, what do we do? And they did not use those terminologies, but they said that, essentially they were saying that we have already moved in the path of maladaptation, because we have replaced all our traditional crops with cash crops, vegetables and others, and apricot and other trees. These are all water exhausting. So they know that in 20, 30 years of time, their village is going to be inhabitable. And they are now thinking, do we replace these with, more crops that require lesser water? Or what are other sources of water that they can potentially bring, so that they don't have to move out of that, they don't have to leave the village. That depth of knowledge was fascinating. And I think this is where, that vision for future was so clear. But often policymakers don't take that into consideration. This becomes critically important, so that people, and this is where again, that managed retreat becomes important. So if you are retreating, don't retreat into another risk area. So if it is a managed retreat, be it community or be it by government, and government support becomes very important, because you cannot leave the entire burden on community alone. So what can you help in terms of identifying safer areas? Might not be completely safe, but relatively safer areas, right? And also people who are more used to avalanche, they will not be used to river floods. So how do you prepare people, even if it is relatively safer places? So that entire management of that retreat becomes very important, because if it doesn't happen, planned relocation by government or rampant just relocation by households, that will not have a positive adaptive, you cannot call it an adaptive strategy. So I think that anticipatory action, that's where is the missing element. And this is very much doable within the existing knowledge system. Gaps in laws, for instance, like as I said, internal migration, we do not consider that at all. In urban context, we just consider that as a problem, as a source of problem. We do not consider, and this is where it becomes very tricky. So climate finance, we are all talking about in agriculture sector and all. Now the dichotomy here, the disconnection here is if people are using migration as an adaptation strategy, does it not make sense that government and others, climate finance also for that matter, actually help people support that? Because then that judicious use of limited resources becomes more productive. I know most people don't think about it. Whenever you are talking about climate finance, only disaster gets, migration is there, but it's mostly disaster. And this is where that building that evidence on how, you can do, how migration can be supported, internal and international, so that people can actually adapt. So I think for that discourse needs to be really had. I remember in 2011-12, when I was still working on the migration sector, when I initially started to talk about reintegration, return and reintegration, no buy-in. People were saying that, oh, how can you focus on only migrants because it will not be fair. That was the discourse that I had. But I was quite convinced that you need to work on it. Otherwise, the desperation of migrants, the initial driver is not addressed. Then you are my worry was, it's not only continuation, prolong of migration cycle, but that migration will be passed on from one generation to another. And that's why I was very confident that we need to work on reintegration if we are serious about making migration work and reducing the migration cycle. And if you don't want another 2-3 generations continuing in that same migration. This is where I strongly believe that through discourse we need to start now, we need to start building evidences on where are those entry points, how do you start integrating this, so that that adaptive capacity, well-being is improved, and then find where those supports are needed. Because at the end of the day, climate finances are meant to, improve adaptive capacities, adaptation, and to reduce mitigations, right? So this is where I think that discourse really needs to happen. Right now, it's very abstract. I also don't understand totally. If you ask me how to do it, probably at this moment I don't know. But if we start to, continue this discourse, I'm sure in 1 or 2 years' time, if I come back, I probably will tell you how to do it. Adaptation needs, again, when you put population as homogeneous, then you really don't understand what are the, differential adaptation needs. And this is where, when I'm saying that when migration in Nepal, when it is this large scale, we really need to factor in that fact. That what are the differential needs created because of migration. Because often people are talking about small investment that they want to do it in a more resilient sectors. Climate and other risks are also there, but the climate is a major risk now. So we don't really try to understand their needs in that sense. Would be. So this is where I strongly believe that migration and adaptation, climate change adaptation, stakeholders and scholars have to come together and understand this better to find that solution. Drivers, I think Sadiksha, migration will always be a multiple driver decision. It will never be one. But having said that, in these 2 cases where there was this small migration or relocation, it was very clear. Everybody said water. Now, how much that water and climate, that attribution was a little challenging part, but in Ramechhap it was very clear. Luckily, there was a weather station which had data, and that data showed that very slight decline, but decline was there. But even there, like when we probe deeper, is climate the only factor for that water scarcity? And people said, no, there are other factors. So what they said was, for last 6 decades, that gradual decline, we have seen it. So somebody in his 60s, 70s were saying, from our childhood, we can see that decline. But 2 accelerators happened. One, 2015 earthquake, that completely changed that water pathways, and they said that was. And also the roads, that also, that there were certain accelerators, but climate, that gradual decline was there. So that's how I think that attribution works. But inevitably, it will be a multiple driver. But I also feel that right now, methodologically, it has been a challenge to capture this trigger, climate as a trigger for migration. I remember in Uttarakhand when we were doing this research, and we wanted to know if climate is a driver, and people were laughing. They said that when Kedarnath happened, so many people got displaced, but these people have already moved. And you are talking to people who are here, but those villages who have moved, you are not able to talk. So obviously you are going to miss out on climate drivers in your study. And that's something I think I have put it as a limitation, if I remember in my report, that, because we are doing a household survey in origin, those people who have actually has been displaced, we completely lost that category. And also because, migration, there is lag effect. So when disasters happen, or large scale because that erodes your capacity to move as well. So earthquake might have happened in 2015, now this is not a climate, but just a disaster. Let's take Melamchi. Melamchi's impact on migration you would begin to see only now, because it would take some time for people to see if there is something that they can do it there itself. When people run out of all those options, then they start to think of, okay, now let's go. Or even if they have decided to go, when you have lost so much in disaster, migration needs that money, right? So it also takes time for people to generate that money for making that. That lagged impact is also there. I think there are multiple things that methodologically we have not been able to capture. And this is where now I've become a big fan of qualitative methods, because that actually manages to capture much nicely this complex decision-making process.
Thank you, Aminaji. I think we are almost on time for today's lecture. Do we have any last questions on the floor? So if you do not have any questions, then I would like to just end today's lecture. Thank you so much, Aminaji, for accepting our invitation and for this such an insightful thought on this topic that's gaining such an interest in Nepal as well. And thank you to all the participants who came here to attend the lecture, and I hope I will see you again in Baha's next lecture as well. Thank you so much.